Hey, my name is Beau. I'm a musician and music teacher, and in this video, I want to talk about a really powerful ear training method or technique that you can apply to your own practicing that will help you grow your harmonic audiation skills. So I want to split this video into three parts here. One is some of the problems with traditional techniques or common techniques of ear training. And then I want to talk about some of the potential solutions and then give you some very concrete suggestions for how you can engage in the type of ear training or audiation work that I would recommend that you do. So, the first problem with ear training is that I find that people's ear training tends to be extremely focused on things that do not transfer super well to them playing actual music. And so there's a couple issues going on here. The first one is that a lot of people spend a lot of time memorizing how to sing intervals. So maybe learn how to sing a perfect fifth up or like a major third up or a perfect fourth down. And I think at some point it's fantastic for musicians to know how to do that. But the question is that going to serve your playing music and participating with music? And in my experience, for beginners and intermediate players, that tends to not really enhance their musicianship. And so, for example, if we were going to maybe play a jazz tune together and I said, can you take a solo on the chord progression of this song? Is that type of ear training going to actually help you play through the chord progressions very well? Because a lot of the times when I encounter students who have engaged with a lot of that kind of training, they'll do things like, okay, the first chord is a C, so I could play a C note, and then I could sing up a perfect fifth or play up a perfect fifth, and that would get me a G note, and that will work because it'll fit over the chord. And to be honest, that type of thinking is just way too slow to actually improvise with. And so if you're not familiar with what the word audiation means, I recommend you go back to the first video on my channel and get up to speed on that. This word audiation is super important when it comes to ear training or just musical development in general. But audiation really means to be able to understand music and think in the language of music, if we were to call music a language. And so people that have not developed their audiation skills very well, when they tend to play music or improvise, they tend to think very, very theoretically. So, okay, I'm playing a C note. That means I push this button here. Now I'm playing an E note. Okay, I got to push this button here. And that's like the major third. And thirds are good because they fit in chords. It's very cerebral and it's very intellectual. And the confusing thing is, it's not like any of that information is incorrect, but that is not actually audiation. If I were to sing a tonic triad, bum, 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 that is like a little piece of musical information, like a word. And that's what we want to lean our ear training towards. We want to lean our ear training towards developing sets of patterns or vocabulary. And so music, strictly speaking, is not a language. It's very useful to use an analogy between how we acquired our first language and how to learn how to play and engage with music effectively. There's a lot of parallels between how the two are structured. But basically, we want to think of learning music like we learned our first language. And how do we do that? We listen to our parents and our siblings and our community talk. We listened to the language to a very, very high volume. We were listening to words and people having conversations. And we ourselves started copying some of those words, started copying short phrases, started copying sentences. And by the time we kind of roll into preschool and kindergarten, we're able to actually talk quite well. And then we start learning formal things like, okay, here's how you read and write, here's some basics of grammar. But traditionally, when people try to learn music, or even when a lot of people try to learn a second language, they start with a super theoretical top-down perspective. And so, for an example, with language instruction, when I took Spanish in high school as an elective, the Spanish instruction I was given was very grammar based, and it was very top-down heavy. And so I'm a terrible Spanish speaker, and I don't think it's because my teacher was intentionally trying to make me struggle with Spanish, but the method just quite frankly didn't work. And this parallels the same method that a lot of musicians are going through. They're learning theory in a way that's not actually very useful because they're not learning the fundamental audiation skills that they need to learn for the theory to make sense. And so I've said this on tons of videos on my channel. I am a huge fan of learning music theory, but there's a time and a place for it. And most people, when it comes to like music theory and just their audiation skills or their pattern vocabularies are very weak, and they think they know a lot of music theory. But the question is, if you can't actually refer to sounds, so if I give you a music theory concept like the 2-5-1 of B minor, if you can't refer to sounds in your mind, that music theory concept, it's just standing for kind of like a conceptual model of how chords are constructed. It's not actually referring to a piece of musical vocabulary. And it becomes very difficult to actually use that when you're playing pieces, when you're improvising, when you're listening to someone else's music. Can you understand it? And so my recommendation is to, if you're a beginner, an intermediate, or a developing player, just put aside this project of going super off the rails with music theory, put aside this project of learning how to sing intervals, and focus more on singing chord tones. Singing chord tones is one of the best things you can do in terms of the highest leverage activities where you can get the most out of your practice time. And now, the reason why you want to sing chord tones is the music you're listening to is going to be made up of chord progressions. So whether you're playing Bach, whether you're playing classical music, whether you're playing pop, bluegrass, jazz, it almost really doesn't matter if the kind of music you're playing comes from Western harmony, or even if it's not a Western-based type of music, there's most likely going to be chord progressions in it. You want to actually build a vocabulary of chord progressions. Now, there's different ways we can do this. We can build a vocabulary of chord progressions where, you know, we hear a piano player playing a couple chords and we're able to identify those chords. And that is a skill that you can learn to do if you have the proper guidance. Now, when it comes to ear training, what you really want to spend your time doing in the beginning is learning how to sing tonal patterns. And really what a tonal pattern is, it's almost like a set of arpeggios that are voice-led that act as little units of musical vocabulary. So here's a set of patterns I give most of my new students. And so the way that we work with these is you play a pattern, or I would play a pattern for the student, have the student sing the pattern back. Bum, bum, bum. And we keep going. Dun, 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 dun. Bum, bum, bum. Bum, 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 bum. So that's the basics of how this kind of ear training in the tradition I come from would unfold. Now, some points here. First, we listen to the pattern, then we sing it back. And the goal that I have for my students and for myself when I'm working on this is to memorize the set of patterns. And memory is so profoundly important for building a set of musical patterns or a musical vocabulary, because if you don't have patterns memorized, they're very difficult to use when you're playing music, when you're composing, when you're improvising, or when you hear other people perform a pattern, you can figure it out. And so what we want to do is, at first, the first level is to just learn how to sing the pattern accurately, and then we want to work on committing it to memory. Now, the real point of why we're doing this is that we now have started to build a little bit of vocabulary that outlines certain chords. And now the example I just gave here, I did like 1 chord and a 5 chord. But in the beginning, I'm not really telling students what I'm playing. I'm just trying to make sure they connect with it, with their audiation, with their ear. And this is a little bit different than how ear training is done in a lot of traditions, where the student is given like a very theoretical kind of peek into what's going on early on. So they might learn that like this was 1-3-5, or this was a C chord going up. And in the beginning, in the tradition that I come from, that is totally not accented. The student is given the set of patterns. They don't even know if it's tonic chords, dominant chords. They don't know really what's going on. They're just memorizing the patterns. Once they have the patterns memorized and they can sing them accurately, then we start giving the patterns names. Now, there's many different systems for naming notes. You could use intervals like 1, 3, and 5. You could use note names, C, E, G. You could use solfege, whether movable do with a La bass minor or Do bass minor, Do mi so. And there are benefits and drawbacks to all of these systems. And so some people get quite extreme about one system being like the system and being better than all other systems. I don't really buy that. I think there are different ways of looking at how we name notes, and systems like solfege or interval structures that move around, those have a lot of benefits, but learning actual note names has a whole nother set of benefits. And so I would recommend that you stay flexible in terms of what system or systems you're willing to use. But essentially, after we can sing it and we have it memorized, we give the patterns note names. Now, once the patterns have names, we can start doing all kinds of things. So I could play this pattern for someone, bum, 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 and I could ask them, does that sound like the C major tonic chord? Does that sound like C, E, G, or 1, 3, 5? And they can answer yes or no. So we can start doing games where I'm quizzing people on, are they able to link the name with what they're hearing? Another thing we can do is we can start putting the patterns out of order. So traditionally, when they first start working on these patterns, the student will always do them in the same order. I could start putting the patterns out of order. Can you tell me what the pattern was? Can you tell me what the pattern was? And so we start to actually make sure that the name of the pattern, and even if there's a bit of music theory, is really fused with the sound. So that's one of the benefits, is that it prevents music theory from being this very cerebral thing that doesn't apply to our actual music making, and it makes the music theory more as a set of labels that we apply to sounds that we know. So that's one benefit of the patterns, is that they will help you start to figure out, when you hear these patterns kind of in the wild, you will start to be able to figure out what these sounds are because you have committed these to memory and you've worked with them. Now, one of the other benefits of the patterns is that if you are going to start improvising, they act almost like musical words that you can use when you're improvising. So if I was going to take a solo and the chord progression started with a C chord to a G chord, I could do something like this. And right there, what I did is I kind of took the skeleton of this, bum, 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 and I added a little bit of spice to it and made the pattern kind of come alive. And that's one of the ways that we can learn to improvise that tends to be a lot better than starting someone with, okay, here's a C scale, now just improvise for me, but I'm not going to give you any more tools other than that. And this is really something that people struggle with. When people are learning to improvise, generally speaking, people are quite terrible at nailing chord changes. People tend to do a lot of noodling. You hear a lot of playing like that when someone is told, okay, play this scale over this chord. There tends to not be a lot of accuracy in terms of... So if you actually analyze that little solo that I played, most good musicians would very clearly know the chords that I was trying to outline, even though there were no chords being actually played in the background. And that's really the benefit of these patterns, is that they train you to hear the underlying harmony inside melodies. And so a lot of times when I'm listening to a melody, what my brain can do is just extract what the underlying harmony should be. I mean, this is a famous melody. I'll leave the song unnamed for now, but this little thing, this is really just this pattern, bum, 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 and it's dressed up a little bit, bum, bum, ba-dum, bum. And that's one of the things that these tonal patterns start training the mind to do, is anytime you hear something, you start hearing this underlying kind of implied harmony, and that's really difficult to learn unless you just straight up learn to sing patterns and memorize them. So one of the questions that I often get from students who start to work on this is, well, do I have to sing? And the answer is no. Strictly speaking, you don't have to sing. I think you can learn to audiate with just an instrument. But the thing is, singing is so powerful for this. And the reason for that is, for you to sing these patterns back, you can't really rely on music theory. If you're sitting at a piano, you can memorize, okay, that's supposed to be C, E, G, and C's here, I push this button, E's here, I push this button, and you've got to fake it, right? But when I ask you to sing the pattern back, you either sing it back correctly or you don't. And so singing puts a lot of pressure on your audiation skills. And in terms of developing tonal audiation skills, using your singing voice as a feedback mechanism is just so much more efficient than trying to do it only on an instrument. Now, what I have a lot of students do at some point is I will teach them to play the patterns on an instrument and then coach them to sing the pattern back themselves. Boom, boom, boom. Boom, 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 boom. And that's what I tend to do when I make patterns. So again, singing is not strictly necessary, but it's so powerful. It's kind of insane not to use the singing voice to increase your audiation. You could whistle if you want to. Singing itself is not magical. It's just having to produce the sounds without being able to rely on note names or music theory is just invaluable. Now, if you are maybe more of an advanced musician and you can already audiate things like a 1 chord, a 4 chord, or a 5 chord, you can use this exact same process to teach yourself to audiate maybe more advanced chord progressions. And so one that I was working on a while ago was something like this. That was one, and then there was one that was related to it. And so that goes through like a 2-5-1, and then it goes through a 2-5-1 with a chord substitution on one of the chords. And it just ends up being a lot more efficient rather than trying to navigate these chord progressions using like a lot of interval rules and okay, here's the third and here's the fifth, which by the way, that stuff's fantastic once you can actually audiate this stuff. Just commit the damn sounds to memory and then start improvising with them. So instead of that would be kind of a basic version, you can dress them up. And what people find is when they start working with patterns like this, their improvisation tends to make way more sense harmonically. It just sounds a lot more satisfying for the listener because they're actually kind of getting their hands dirty and getting inside the chord progressions that are inside the things they're improvising over. So this is just like a crash course on how to get started with this. If you're interested in this topic, you got to check out a guy named Edwin E. Gordon. He developed this thing called music learning theory. He was a wonderful music education researcher. Not enough people know about him. I'm showing you, these are 98% his methods with a little bit of tweaking or hot rodding based off my own education and my own experimentation with this. But these are really ideas that come from his style of teaching music called music learning theory that I'm very much involved in. I come from that tradition. So if you're interested in this, you should follow up on his material. Unfortunately, Edwin Gordon is no longer with us. He passed away years ago, but he left aside a lot of wonderful books, a lot of articles, and I highly recommend you check this stuff out if you're interested in it. If you're interested in music lessons that would actually guide you through this kind of thing, I do a lot of ear training or audiation work with people. I also teach piano and guitar. And if you want to get started with that kind of thing, my email's in the description below. My website's in the description below. Just send me a message. Let me know a little bit about yourself and we can get started with this. In the next video on my channel, I hope to go into a little more detail about a harmonic learning roadmap. So, say you're getting started with all of this audiation stuff. What should you learn first? Should you learn tonic chords or dominant chords, or how do you start with all this stuff? So in the next week or so, there'll be a video right here, and that'll guide you through what the actual roadmap for doing this kind of work looks like in terms of which kinds of chord progressions should you learn first, because it's not really random. You don't want to start with chord progressions that are maybe too difficult. And there's a core set of skills, no matter what genre you're interested in playing, that are worth starting with. So check out that video. And until next time, thanks so much for tuning in.